you're recording this meeting. Okay. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr.
Yes.
Officially Dr.
Finally.
Jazmin Scarlett, who is going to be our lead-off speaker for this special seminar series, all virtual, because needs must. But this is the first talk in the Geographies of Risk special seminar series that the School of Geography and Environmental Science will be hosting from now into all the way through the spring, just because that's how the scheduling is going to work. And these talks are going to work. They complement a series of interviews that I had the pleasure of conducting over the course of this autumn with people who are working on concepts and issues of risk in all kinds of ways, settings, topics. It's a hugely interdisciplinary mix of speakers when you put them all together. And so this today, starting with Dr. Scarlett, is really exciting because her work is very much at the intersection between human geography and physical geography. She's going to lead us on a trip through what she's been working on, the subject of socio-volcanology, people living in volcanic hazard zones, people, the life on volcanic islands, and what arises out of that are issues of dark geoheritage. So I'm very pleased to have her with us today, and take it away, Doctor.
Right, thank you. Now, full goes to pulling plan. Yes, perfect. Right, I'll just minimize you. Okay, so yes, hello, welcome everybody. So today I will be talking about some research I did as a visiting researcher in Aarhus University in Denmark with Professor Felix Fried. And this is on the subject of the dark geocultural heritage of volcanoes. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the project, define what dark heritage is, talk about the methodology I use, and then I will split this up into what the project itself was two parts. So the first part I will talk about citation analysis, and then I will be going through some kind of, it was more of exploratory kind of ways in which volcanoes can be subjects of dark geoculture. Focusing on Montserrat, St. Vincent, Italy, and Germany, and then how this links to tourism, and then summarize. So the project. So my project was part of a wider project called Apocalypse Then, the LaCascada Volcanic Corruption, Deep Environmental History, and Europe's Geocultural Heritage. And started 3 years ago, and it's actually going to end next month, which is actually quite sad. But it was a big project, and it's investigating the LaCascada's eruption from a paleosocial perspective. So the LaCascada, I will be talking about that a little bit more later, but it is a volcanic area in Germany. And essentially, I was brought in to bring together cultural and geological heritage perspectives together, and particularly focus on if culture is important in disaster risk reduction, and geocultural heritage, also in its darker shades, is important in building resilience. And how this actually came about, me ending up in Denmark, is Felix emerged in my Twitter DMs, and I can't remember exactly what I posted, but I posted saying that, I was going to be doing a presentation on my PhD, and he was like, hey, what you're doing is really cool, do you want to work together? And I was like, sure. And then next year, managed to get some the visiting researcher scholarship funding to work in Denmark for 5 months. So it was a very pleasant experience working in the archaeology department. But what is dark heritage? So dark heritage are sites of human trauma and death and destruction of the environment that surviving communities inherit. So these, for example, would be patterns battlefield sites, war sites, abandoned prisons or even present-day prisons, sites of genocide, assassinations, slavery, and so on. Even something as, I wouldn't say tame, but for example, ghost walks. Those are also examples of dark heritage, even if they are fabricated. But what is interesting about dark heritage is that it's problematic, unwanted, difficult, dissonant, and often contested. And if sites are exploited for tourism, it is dark tourism. So here, for example, is a display case of skulls in the site of Pompeii in Italy, near Vesuvius. And for this, when I revisited the site, because I had the opportunity to go there after I've actually done this work, thinking about, actually this is like death on display, and like thinking about the ethics around, like, is this okay? Is this acceptable? What does this teach us? Just this display of skulls, what does it show us? But in terms of the methodology that I used, comprised of a few parts. So the first part was systematic literature review, because what I wanted to do was show the connection or disconnect between various different heritage disciplines. So this was geoheritage, geotourism, geoconservation, geoethics, cultural heritage, dark heritage, and dark tourism. And I used this using a program called Publish or Perish, which I think is kind of funny to call a program such as thing. But what I did is I scanned basically the internet. It basically pulls all sources of the internet for general key terms. So this is where I put in cultural heritage, see what comes up. Then looked at top 10 papers based on citations, top 10 authors based on how much they published, the range of years in publication, forward citation on top 10 papers. So essentially, where do these top 10 papers end up being cited in? And also then top 10 journals that show this range of research. So there's a lot of numbers here, but I'll break it down for everybody. So the first result is that cultural heritage is a long established discipline, field, and it is the primary field of heritage studies, with substantial amounts of theory and methods in place. Yet the geoheritage variants, they do appear a little bit later, but they have a lot more citations. But this is mainly because cultural heritage, they're mainly published in reports and books, whereas geoheritage disciplines, which are inherently more scientific, earth science disciplines, they are more published in journal articles, whereas journal articles, you could argue, are more accessible than books and reports. And geoethics is quite a young discipline, and it's mainly not cited a lot, but it mainly pops up a lot in the European Geosciences Union, EGU, kind of conference papers. In terms of top 10 authors and top 10 papers, so this I used like a Venn diagram, which didn't really turn out really Venn-like. But you can see here there is overlap between certain number of fields depending on the way you arrange them. So in terms of top 10 authors, cultural heritage and does connect. Dark heritage is kind of left on its own. As would be expected, geoconservation, geoheritage, and geotourism are rather interlinked, but then geoethics is rather left on its own. This is probably because it is a younger discipline compared to the three disciplines. In terms of top 10 papers, there's a different swap around. So cultural heritage is a standalone, and then we see dark tourism, dark heritage connecting. But then, interestingly, only geoconservation and geoheritage connect, whereas geotourism and geoethics are separate. This is just to visualize it in another way. So these red nodes are authors, and the green nodes are the fields. The bigger the node, the more kind of papers associated with that author. And essentially we can see that a lot of work is being done in geotourism with a lot of different authors. But then there's only a few, well, a handful or cluster that connects that with geoheritage. You can see like quite a lot of the geoheritage bubbles are kind of like trying to push towards cultural heritage. We see here cultural heritage is kind of self-contained with this authorship. It doesn't really expand that much, although there's only one author that connects that with geotourism. And we see here a little bit of connection between dark heritage. What I find interesting is that dark tourism is taught more and researched more than dark heritage, even though you would argue that the dark heritage should come first before the dark tourism. So here is kind of different setup. So this is the connections between journals and where research is published. And what so it appears like there's not a lot of connections, but actually the ones I've highlighted, obviously you can't see very well, unfortunately, but it is actually tourism-related journals that actually connect all of these fields in one way or another, or one or two of them. So, interestingly, only one paper connects natural hazards between geotourism and geoethics, even though you would argue that there should be other ways in which they should connect. And current issues in tourism connects geotourism and dark tourism. And interestingly, different tourism journals connect between cultural heritage, and dark tourism. So the second half of the research was thinking about the ways in which volcanoes bring together cultural heritage, and geocultural heritage via dark tourism. So Montserrat is probably a very well-known recent example of how this volcano is a site of dark heritage, whereas its destruction of Plymouth, the capital, and quite a lot of settlements in the vicinity of the eruption of the volcano. And this is definitely dark heritage in terms of its destruction, but it's also related to its legacy of colonialism and slavery, is also dark heritage. In terms of cultural heritage, it's the destruction and creation of heritage, essentially, because today Montserrat is rebuilding, the volcano is more stable now, so people are slowly returning back to the island and reclaiming what has been taken from the volcano. And also mass evacuations as well could be seen as cultural heritage, as most of the diaspora of Montserrat is now in the UK, as Montserrat is an overseas territory of the UK. Also interestingly, that brought up is actually St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day is quite important on Montserrat, as that compared to neighbouring Caribbean islands, British West Indian Caribbean islands, it is Catholic, whereas other locations are Protestant mainly. And it's St. Patrick's Day, once again, as well as being Catholic, it links to, of course, Irish heritage, which is actually, that's quite different compared to other islands where it's mainly Scottish or English or Welsh. But with Montserrat, what with St. Patrick's Day, it's become, I would say it's become sort of like a meeting, gathering point for people displaced by the volcano every year to come together to celebrate not only St. Patrick's Day, but the legacy of the island and of their cultural celebrations. In terms of geoheritage, of course, we can immediately say it is related to the volcano and the geology, but it's also related to the destruction akin to the 1902 eruption of Pompeii on Martinique. And actually, this statue is from Martinique, not Montserrat, as both Plymouth and St. Clair were cultural, economic, and political hubs of these islands, and of course they were destroyed by the volcanoes. And also the fact that both are termed as like the Caribbean the Pompeii of the Caribbean. So St. Pierre and Martinique sometimes referred to as the Pompeii of the Caribbean, whereas Plymouth is sometimes referred to as the modern day Pompeii of the Caribbean. And of course, what ties us all together as well is the volcano being a valuable learning tool for not only volcanologists and geologists and archaeologists, but also for politics and anthropology as well. And it's really important to understand all these things. So for St. Vincent, also in the Caribbean, different volcanic history to Soufrière Hills. But the cultural heritage is the presence of the indigenous communities that still survive on the island. So there's two groups. There's Kalinigo, who were the original indigenous inhabitants that came from Venezuela and populated the Lesser Antilles. And then the Guafana, who are runaway slaves who intermarried with the Kalinigo. So those are two cultural groups that now live on St. Vincent. And it's mainly about their lasting presence of that indigenous community. And also here, the presence of petroglyphs. So this photo is not really laid out, but there's actually rock art basically on loads of different rocks throughout the island. And it shows the lasting presence of the indigenous culture and the Armoridians. And in fact, these sites have been submitted to gain cultural heritage status from UNESCO because these are places of tourism. So this is actually a photo taken from my stepsister when she visited St. Vincent. As well as indigenous, it's also related to colonialism. So for St. Vincent, it was colonized by French and British, and there's still lasting evidence of both of those colonies on the island. For example, a lot of settlements and villages and whatnot, they either have French names or have British or British English names. And in fact, those places that have French names actually speak French patois, mainly compared to more English patois, which is quite interesting. And this could be then a site of contested cultural heritage areas, which is the more kind of dominant histories in French or the British. So in terms of dark heritage, as I briefly mentioned, it's related to colonialism, and it's also related to slavery as well. And there's everlasting evidence of slavery and of the colonial era present across the island. Most of the settlements today were once upon a time plantations, and there's actually some ruins of water mills and stuff. Still actually go and see them, and they're just there, left to decay in the environment. And that itself would be an interesting part of heritage. Of course, again, it is destruction left by La Soufrière. So La Soufrière is the most active volcano, one of the most active volcanoes in the Caribbean. It's erupted 4 times in recorded history, and 3 of those eruptions, they have killed quite a large number of the population. The last eruption in 1979, no one died, but the destruction caused by the environment is quite severe. But what is really interesting and nice to the geoheritage is how quickly the environment recovers from volcanic eruptions. So this here, on the left-hand side, this photograph is of the La Soufrière Trail to go to the summit of the crater that I took in 2016. This is rainforest, and it's overwhelmingly rainforest. Like it's almost overgrown, and makes you think that eruption has never happened here. But this happened, this growth, this it was like this 36 years later after the eruption, which shows that actually the environment bounces back quite quickly from these volcanic eruptions. And this actually is exploited for geotourism. In fact, that there's lots of, it's not just the rainforests, also the beaches and cays related to the archipelago of the Grenadines. But like the beaches are like pure white sand or black sand. So the water is amazing, nice and warm. So you actually get quite a lot of tourists who come to St. Vincent, mainly go on hiking trails across the whole mountain range of St. Vincent. And also included here in the middle image, children, school children. So what's interesting is because Das Frère is a very active volcano. It will likely erupt in the future. So it's very important to keep raising awareness and keep the knowledge of the volcano alive in the society. So actually every year there's the Volcano Awareness Week that goes out and does outreach work with schools and in communities. So here I was arguing that actually they're inheriting that knowledge and that heritage of the volcano and of the geoheritage and the cultural heritage and the dark heritage, learning about how bad this volcano that they live with can get. So for Italy, of course, Renaissance Vesuvius and Pompeii, and mainly for this, this was mainly where Felix took over as being the archaeologist. It was more of what is the fascination about Pompeii? Because when people go to Naples, they don't go to Vesuvius. Most people go to Pompeii and to Herculaneum and the other sites that were impacted by the 79 AD eruption. And it is like when you walk around there, you don't realise that the volcano is well, from being a person in Pompeii, it looks like the volcano is actually quite far away. And it actually makes you feel kind of disconnected, even though the volcano destroyed the place that you were standing in. And it's what is it that attracts people to that site, and what makes people, be fascinated by the depth that's on display. This top image here, I took a picture of people taking a picture of a group of skeletons that were found down the old harbour of Pompeii, taking shelter, trying to save themselves. And here, of course, the famous castings of people and animals that were on display. What is it that attracts us to those sites? And the fact that it inspires art and media throughout the ages in terms of how destructive the volcano is and how kind of preserved the settlements are and what we can learn from them. But from this as well, I talked about how, of course, Italian volcanologists and science communicators are doing their utmost best to communicate the dangers of Vesuvius. And this is where I kind of brought in the fact that actually there's wine tours for Vesuvius. So wine is grown on slopes of Vesuvius due to obviously the fertile soil, and people actually learn about the geology and about the volcano on these wine tours. And of course, people love wine, lots of people love wine, so why can't we use those more to show that, Vesuvius is a dangerous volcano, but look at these are the benefits that we can get from it as well. So lastly, what's quite interesting is that not a lot of people know that Germany has quite a big, dangerous volcano. So this volcano is the LaCascada. Here it is today as a Mar lake. So essentially this volcano, it erupted near the end of the last ice age. And it was a large and intense eruption. So it was a Plinian eruption, so one of the most dangerous eruptions you can get. But it was also a caldera collapsing forming event. So basically it erupted once and it just basically went big and didn't go home. But what's interesting with this is that the volcanic eruption itself, it happened in several phases, as that's what usually happens in caldera collapsing forming eruptions. It dammed the River Rhine, and then later caused a dam break flood. It covered wide range of the area of the proximal area, but also distant areas with tephra, with ashfall, and it erupted over several days to months. But what's interesting from the archaeological perspective, so Felix does a lot of research on the LaCascada. There's been evidence found of animal tracks preserved in the ash layers, also burnt forests and other macrobotanical remains, and also preservation footprints as well. And also there's loads of archaeological sites found throughout. And for Felix, for example, he's found evidence of when this eruption happened, that hunter-gatherers in Scandinavia were actually cut off from the rest of the continent of Europe due to this volcanic eruption, and it resulted in them actually changing the way they made their tools, as their social network was disrupted, so they had to adapt in their environment from learning how to survive in the environment. But today it is a beautiful lake, and it's a site of water recreation, but also there's medieval monasteries in the area, there's organic farms, and there's also vineyards, and actually caves where beer is stored. So it's a very rich cultural environment with a very dark, very distant history. So for this, we were thinking of a what-if scenario, as when we talk about the volcanic eruptions that may impact the UK and Europe, we mainly turn to the Laki fissure eruption in Iceland in the 1700s, as what would happen if an event on that scale would happen again. But we were thinking, hypothetically, what would happen if we had a big eruption like LaCascada? So this map shows the population density of the area, and essentially that if a volcanic eruption like this would happen again, it will probably be bad. And what I didn't show is actually a map we also use of actually nuclear sites as well, nuclear reactor sites as well, and it's actually quite a lot, quite close to LaCascada. So we said that even though it's very unlikely that anything will happen here again, but what if something did happen here again? It would probably be bad and definitely stretch the limits of how Europe as a collective could cope. But then to tie this all together and link it to tourism, as we found from the first half that actually all these different fields link to tourism in some way. So this diagram here is of cultural services. This is within the United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Assessment published in 2001. And essentially, these are defined as services we obtain from the environment, and there's very different categories. But I focus on cultural services because each of these, I found that volcanoes can actually fit into any of these in one way or another. And what, of course, is important is that each of these things change with culture, as well as the fact that we get those services, we get cultural services from these different things. This is where heritage comes in fact that it can be made and remade. And this is where, then again, critical cultural heritage comes in, whereas that it's okay to have things change, essentially. Whereas geoheritage remains uncritical and remains fixed on what is defined as geoheritage, whereas cultural heritage, critical heritage, it's more fluid in when its definitions of what cultural heritage is, because culture changes through time. So if we combine cultural services with socio-volcanology, we get the volcanic geocultural heritage, which then become contested sites. As we could say that, well, does it change depending on the volcanic kind of history and activity of the volcano? Does it change because of our cultural relations with the environment and the volcano? We can think about it different ways and how our relationships with volcanoes and their landscapes change. And this is where I say that socio-volcanology could actually learn from cultural heritage, in that it's okay to have these things change because culture is changing. But recent research into social volcanology does need cultural understanding. So in terms of risk, vulnerability and resilience, and in terms of hazard mapping, which will require cultural understanding, as for example, maps are interpreted differently by different people. And not every hazard map that you see might not actually be representative of how people understand maps. We can take, for example, the tier 1 and 2 and 3 map we have currently. Who are going to be the people that look at the map and not know what that means? Particularly if they're colourblind, I might say. I'm just leaving that there. But think about different ways, for example, perception influences as well, risk, vulnerability, and resilience. But the cultural dimensions of social volcanology are not fully integrated into cultural heritage and geoheritage dimensions, as well as geoheritage dimensions are not fully integrated into social volcanology. So there is room for volcanology to bridge the gap between cultural heritage and geoheritage, using volcanoes, sites of dark heritage, and being places of cultural services. So this links to geo and dark tourism and other types of tourism in volcanic areas. For example, we can ask, why are people going to these sites? And what are the cultural and geoheritage values to these sites? And can we mix geotourism with dark tourism? Is it possible? And how can these sites remain sustainable as an ecosystem service? As the whole point of the UN's Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is trying to showcase how ecosystems need to be sustained and sustainable for our use. But it's whether are they viewed as such, as sites to be preserved in a way. So of course, volcanic sites particularly hard to preserve sometimes, especially if they are very active locations. But of course, they are subjected to erosion and to the elements. So sometimes it's very hard for us to preserve them for the services that they provide. And particularly, it's where I'm thinking, what if a volcano that hasn't erupted in a while does erupt again? What happens then? Does this reset our understanding of the volcano? Does this reset our cultural services relations to that volcano? Does it change the tourism? What happens? But what if we could reframe volcanoes as cultural services? Because once we introduce that, then that's a way for us to be like, okay, we need to preserve these sites because they actually are beneficial to us. And of course, we see that volcanoes are beneficial to us in terms of fertile soil, the inspiration, the aesthetic values, social relations, basically all these subcategories of cultural services. This is how volcanoes are important, but we need to find a way to show that, to argue that they are worth preserving, they're worth engaging with, they're worth understanding more, and not just for researchers, but for tourists as well. Because sometimes, most of the time, tourists are left out on understanding the risk and vulnerabilities, as not just on the tourist's perspective, they think that actually no, it's okay because I don't live here, so I can just go away when there's danger. But then thinking about actually there's local people that live with this, what do they have to live with? So they can understand risk in that way. Yeah. So to summarise, cultural heritage professionals have developed countless ways of engaging local communities and cultural heritage sites universally to tell stories of past human environmental relations. And from here, it is but a small set of thinking volcanic hazards together with cultural heritage and cultural history. In terms of historical data, geological, archival, and archaeological or past eruptions can be fed into building community resilience through cultural services. And accepting the entanglement of geological and cultural heritage, the notion of geocultural heritage has been suggested, presented some suggestions of blending the two through dark heritage. We also argue for increase interdisciplinarity. Thank you. Oh, I got an email.
All right. Thank you so much. And so the next step in terms of digital etiquette, if people would like to ask questions, please raise your hand. I'll moderate in between. But please ask away. We've got some time for questions if people have questions, and I hope you do. And if you don't, then I do.
I suppose you can kick it off then.
Yeah, I'll kick it off. That sounds good. So, all right, I'll jump into the question space. In thinking about this, since your work spans so much time, from the sort of unrecorded hunter-gatherer phase of volcanic Germany all the way to modern eruptions and school kids learning about volcanic hazard week. Do you have a sense of sort of when the cultural awareness window kind of changes? Like, how is it a generation? Like, how long do you have to? Is it 2 generations? Like back to nobody remembers when the last eruption was? Were you getting a sense of any of that?
No, but that is definitely a topic of wide discussion, debate, and there is like work around like environmental memory. Of course, this is where mainly indigenous communities are very good at this in terms of preserving their environmental history and retelling it. So, for example, the Aborigines in Australia, they use the dreaming to remember the environment, to know where to go. The Maori have very deep and rich environmental history retelling. The Native Americans as well do. But this is where it's kind of interesting because for St. Vincent, for example, speaking as I've done a lot of my work there, they remember 1902 and 1979 eruption, but they don't remember 18 and 1718. But with 1812, it's tricky because it happened during slavery, and for St. Vincent, which is quite, I wouldn't say unique, but quite interesting, is that they don't like to associate themselves with being descended from slaves. They don't like the idea of addressing their colonial slavery history at all. Like, even that perpetrates even today in terms of farming on the islands. Like, most people don't go into farming because they associate with slavery. So it's interesting because 1812, the eruption itself, it did kill people, and it actually caused quite a lot of disruption to the island, to the agricultural industry, and that's important to know, but they don't want to know it. So that's the discussions I'm having right now. Now that I have been accepted and my questions have been accepted and whatnot, I am in talks with the people that do these volcano awareness weeks. So, like, how could we include the 1812 eruption without it being uncomfortable for people to know about? Because understanding volcanic history is really important, but also you have to approach it in a culturally sensitive way. But in terms of generations, I think it just depends on the society and depends on how long you keep talking about it, really. And it's usually, if people in that area, if they don't move away, then it usually stays. But if people move away, then it goes, because obviously then there's the influence by other factors that, globalization, essentially. They're affected by globalization. And that actually relates back again to them remembering 1902. Only the indigenous communities I spoke to remember 1902. Not people that were not indigenous remember 1902. They only remember 1979. So I think it's just the way that you tell these stories and then how to preserve those stories as well. So it depends. But we need to look to the past to understand what's going on right now. But I think most people, or quite a lot of people, are like, but it's in the past, it happened, doesn't matter now. But obviously, me being someone who likes to look at historical eruptions, be like, look, it does matter. And this is why.
Other questions from the field? There we go. Eleanor.
Hi, I feel really bad. I missed the first 20 minutes of your talk, so I might be about to ask you something you've already said. I'm sorry, I was in another meeting. But thank you so much. It was really interesting, and it's really good to see people doing this kind of actually interdisciplinary work. It was super interesting. I just wanted to ask you something. I think it was on your last slide. You spoke about how this work might allow you to think about sort of building community resilience through cultural heritage. And you might have spoken about this at the start, but I was really interested in, what you're sort of meaning by community resilience and how you think this sort of work will help. Thank you.
Yes, so of course, if we're speaking as a geographer, community as a word, it's lots of different meanings. And resilience also has lots of different meanings. But when I say community resilience, I mean that their capacity to cope for if there is a volcanic eruption, essentially. And essentially it is them kind of embracing their past, and like the past of the volcanic eruptions, the past of the environment, the past of their ancestors living with these volcanic eruptions. So I think it's embracing, but then also celebrating, because for one thing, them being there shows that they survived it. And if we go from there, then we can say that actually they can take pride and be like, we can do this because it's been done before, sort of thing. So it's kind of like confidence, and like they know their history, and from that they know what to do. Because we can get signs from history on what we can do to address issues that might be very similar to what they faced in the past, but just in a different lens. So in terms of that, heritage is being proud of your heritage, essentially. So if we fall back to just being proud of who you are and where you come from. And this is essentially like having a sense of place and be like that you have this connection with this volcano. So it is kind of personifying that connection a bit, I would say, and be like, this is a good thing. Like, of course, this volcano is dangerous and it has destroyed in the past, but it's okay to be in a situation where, like, okay, we know how dangerous it is. We need to move forward and be like, this is how we can survive. And this is actually something I want to research further. I've actually submitted a Leverhulme application for this, in searching that idea of place identity and that linking to heritage. As for what we see, like place identity is very strong for certain people around the world. And what I found with my time researching volcanoes is that people that live in volcanoes, they have such pride in where they come from. And they do have, sometimes obviously it's a negative relation to volcano, but most of the time it's like they understand that they're in an environment that is hazardous, but they just live with it. So I want to explore that more in terms of what makes people, taking that pride in where they live, in terms of how does that reflect into resilience, because it must do in some way, to be like, okay, I know what to do because this is what I've lived with, this is what I understand about it in the past.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. A much more complex way than some scholars use resilience. So it was really interesting to hear you say more about it. Thank you.
Well, I have one more then, if because just to stick with the environmental memory notion, or the connecting the idea of that, because it makes me think of makes me think of a way. So environmental memory or landscape memory is a thing that comes up all the time in geomorphology. As a, it's not really debate. It's more like this open question, like, how do you recognize it when you're looking at it? Is kind of the way it comes up. How much when you look at a set of landforms, or you try to analyze the terrain of a given landscape, how are you able to detect kind of the changes you're interested in versus aspects of these landforms that have been inherited from past events and things like that? And the idea of this like merging environmental memories of two kinds. So there's like the changing volcanic landscape as its geomorphology shifts over time, following like the wholesale changes that would come after, like immediately after an eruption, and then mapping the social environment of that place onto the same kinds of, the same physical footprint. And just, part of that would be like teaching people what the landscape memory, or not just teaching people, but like, learning the different ways in which people look at that landscape and see in it these legacies of past physical events. Just, that's what your talk made me kind of think of in that way. I was wondering if there's a huge arcuate landslide scar, basically the collapse of part of the larger volcanic structure on Tenerife that I've seen in the one time I've been there. And we were, you're just like, it's they're pretty sheer sides, and in the DEM of that, it looks very, very stark. And there's a bunch of, it's all developed. What you're looking at, you're like, that whole thing is is a slide, and it's these, especially, I wonder if it's something especially about volcanic islands where you get to see that in clear relief.
Unless, of course, it's St. Vincent, where it's covered by rainforest 30 years later, so you can't see it.
Right.
This is actually something I had a problem with in my PhD, where I found evidence of something that's not been in the archives. Found evidence of something that happened during the 1902 eruption, where you can't see today. So I was back and forth with the volcanologists in the Caribbean, where is this? And they're like, this didn't happen, this doesn't exist. I was like, well, it did exist because I have photographs of it. And then they looked at the photographs, but that's not there now. That's there. So it's quite interesting how some volcanic islands, they erode so quickly, or they're overgrown so quickly that sometimes you can't see it. And yeah, it's something that's vexed me, that I want to do more research on. Basically, I've reached the point this did happen, so we need to find out more of how it happened and where it's gone. So that's a really new thing about volcanic islands. Sometimes they erode so quickly, and then people just live all over them again, because that's what happens. And exactly with St. Vincent, there's areas where there's clear evidence of Laha deposits, but there's villages over them. So it's these are Laha prone areas that there's people living across them. It's how can you communicate the fact that maybe one day your village might be washed away by Laha? It is fascinating how sometimes there isn't the connection between the environmental history and memory and social memory. It's they do live on two parallel timelines, and you want to try and bring them together.
Absolutely. Well, looking at the clock, thank you so much for your time and for starting off the Geographies of Risk special seminar series. I'm thrilled that you did it, and I really look forward to seeing where this work goes. It's fantastic.